In 2014, the world is watching the Winter Olympics in Sochi, Russia. You see the stunning ski slopes of Krasnaya Polyana, the brand new facilities, the celebration of sport and human achievement. But while the world is cheering, a small group of protesters are desperately trying to get a message out. They're trying to tell anyone who will listen that the athletes, the tourists, the media, they're all skiing on top of mass graves. You see, 2014 wasn't just an Olympic year, it was also the 150th anniversary of a massive, almost completely forgotten genocide. The genocide of the Circassian people, carried out by the Russian Empire, a slaughter that wiped out over 1 million souls. And the very last, desperate battle fought by the Circassian tribesmen took place in 1864, on the exact piece of land where that shiny new Olympic village was built. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that dark secret. We're going to talk about who the Circassians were, why the Russian Empire wanted them gone so badly, and how they used unimaginable brutality to wipe entire villages off the map. This is the story of how the beautiful, sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea were turned into a graveyard for an entire nation, and how one of the biggest, most successful genocides in modern history was almost completely erased from our memory. So, who were these people, the Circassians? Well, they were an ancient people, native to the rugged, beautiful mountains of a region they called Circassia, right along the coast of the Black Sea. Their history is incredibly long, stretching all the way back to the time of the Hittite Empire. But by the 1800s, they weren't an empire. They were a fiercely independent tribal people. They didn't have a single king, or a state, or even any big permanent cities. They were a collection of tribes, about 1.5 million people in total, living in semi-nomadic communities. They lived in villages they called alls, but they didn't always stay in one place for long. Power wasn't held by a government, but by tribal elders within each community. Now, if a huge crisis came along, like an invasion, they could call a big council, a has, where all the leaders from the different alls would get together to figure out what to do. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. To make any decision, every single leader had to agree, a unanimous agreement. As you can imagine, that made it almost impossible to act quickly or decisively against a unified enemy. It was a system built for independence, not for war against an empire. And don't get the wrong idea from the way the Russians talked about them. They weren't just simple shepherds wandering the hills. Some of the tribes that lived on the coast were skilled traders with small towns and connections across the Black Sea. And we have to be honest about their history too. They were involved in the slave trades of the time, connected to both the Ottoman and Russian empires. It was a complex society where Circassians were sometimes the ones doing the enslaving, and sometimes they were the ones being sold into slavery themselves. Then there was their religion. By the 19th century, most Circassians were Muslims, with a few Christian communities here and there, but they also held on to their much older, pre-Islamic beliefs, like ancestor worship. To the very rigid, very orthodox Russian Empire, this was just more proof that they were a strange, pagan, and barbaric people. Their whole way of life was just different. And for the expanding Russian Empire, different was dangerous. Russia's obsession with Circassia really started back in the 1770s, with Catherine the Great. She looked at the map, and she got an idea in her head. Russia must control the entire northeastern shore of the Black Sea. It was strategic. It was about power. The fact that 1.5 million people already lived there, that was just a detail, an obstacle to be removed. So for the next few decades, Russia sent army after army, commander after commander, with one simple goal: take control and push the Circassians out. To justify this to the world and to themselves, they built a narrative. They called the Circassians barbarians. Because they were sometimes known as raiders, Russia painted all of them with that brush. Because they didn't have permanent cities, they were called uncivilized nomads. Because they were Muslims, they were painted as religious enemies inside a Christian empire. And most importantly, because they didn't have a king or a central government, Russia could claim that there was no one to negotiate with. Diplomacy, they said, was impossible. So, they chose violence. And the violence started early. We're talking as far back as 1818. The Russian military was already burning Circassian villages. The commander-in-chief at the time, a man named Alexei Yermolov, led some of the first mass attacks. When a few Circassian tribes refused to help him hunt down men from other tribes, he decided to teach them all a lesson. He had their villages surrounded, forced everyone out, stole all their animals, and burned everything else to the ground. And the sad thing is, compared to what was coming, that was actually merciful. This went on all through the 1820s. A plague swept through the region, killing thousands of Circassians and making them even more vulnerable. Hundreds of their villages were destroyed in Russian raids. By 1830, a whole section of the northern Caucasus Mountains had been completely cleared of Circassians. The survivors fled west, deeper into the mountains, into the parts of Circassia that Russia still couldn't reach. Now, at this point, Russia didn't actually have any legal international claim to this land. But they were about to fix that with a clever move on the geopolitical chessboard. In 1829, Russia ended a war with the Ottoman Empire by signing something called the Treaty of Adrianople. Buried in that treaty was a clause where the Ottomans recognized Russia's claim to the whole Black Sea coast. It didn't say the word Circassia, but the Tsar, Nicholas I, acted like it did. That treaty became his excuse. From the 1830s on, the pressure cooker was turned up. The Russian Army's Caucasus Corps, stationed in the region, became a dumping ground for the worst of the worst from all over the empire. Criminals, political prisoners, guys who were too violent for regular service, and they unleashed hell on the local Circassians. Theft, abuse, and casual violence became a part of daily life. Around 1840, the Russians decided to tighten the screws even more. They set up a naval blockade of the Circassian ports, cutting off all trade. Very quickly, famine began to set in. And this wasn't an accident. This was the plan. The Russian admiral in charge, Lazar Serebrakov, actually wrote a letter to the Tsar, practically giddy with excitement. He said the famine was the perfect opportunity to finally conquer all of Circassia. He even suggested sending in soldiers with the sole mission of burning any crops they could find. If they did that, he wrote, the Circassians would all be the victims of starvation. By this point, the Russian plan was no longer a secret. It was to either kick the Circassians out or kill them and replace them with loyal Russian settlers. Then, in 1854, a tiny sliver of hope appeared. The Crimean War broke out. Russia was now at war with a powerful alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Russia had to pull its best troops out of Circassia to go fight in the Crimea. The European powers even reached out to the Circassians, thinking they could be a useful ally. This was their chance. This was the moment they could have united and pushed the Russians out while they were distracted. But it was also the moment their political system completely failed them. The tribes just couldn't agree on a single leader. They couldn't form a united front. They argued and fought amongst themselves. And by the time the Crimean War ended in 1856, the opportunity was gone. They had missed their last, best chance. The treaty that ended that war, the Treaty of Paris, should have been a moment of relief. Instead, it sealed their fate. It contained a diplomatic trap, and the Circassians walked right into it. The treaty said that Russia had to grant amnesty, basically a pardon, to any part of its empire that had rebelled during the war. Now, Britain actually tried to help the Circassians. They argued that Circassia wasn't technically part of the Russian Empire, so it shouldn't be included. But France and the Ottomans didn't agree. They pointed back to that old treaty from 1829, the one that gave Russia the coastline. The result was a catastrophe. The world's major powers officially recognized Circassia as Russian territory. But because they had rebelled, Russia was not required to give them amnesty. Think about that. The world basically handed Russia a permission slip. It gave them an internationally approved excuse to punish the Circassians for fighting for their own land. It was a green light for genocide, and Russia was about to put its foot on the gas. In the years that followed, Russia flooded the region with soldiers. The entire army that had fought in the Crimea was moved there. Then, after they brutally crushed a rebellion in Chechnya in 1859, all of those hardened veteran troops were moved there too. The Circassians could see what was coming. Some tribes desperately tried to make deals, offering to completely submit if Russia would just leave them in peace. Others ran deeper into the mountains, hoping the rugged land would save them. But it was too late. There were no more deals to be made. There was nowhere left to run. The Circassians would be removed, or they would be cleansed. The man put in charge of this final, bloody chapter was General Nikolai Yevdokimov. He was a tough, experienced, and completely ruthless soldier. To him, the Circassians weren't people, they were savages, an obstacle. The official plan, at first, was still deportation. They started rounding up Circassian families and forcing them onto ships to Turkey. The Russians figured, well, they're Muslims. The Ottoman Empire is Muslim. It's a perfect fit. They didn't even bother to ask the Ottomans if this was okay. They just started sending people. They lied, telling the Ottomans they were just giving the Circassians temporary passports for a pilgrimage to Mecca, knowing full well those passports would be useless for the return trip. But that lie didn't hold up for long. By 1861, Russia just admitted what it was doing. They gave the Circassians a choice. They could either go to Turkey or be resettled somewhere in the frozen swamps of rural Russia, basically a death sentence by another name. The Russians were genuinely shocked when so many Circassians chose the third, unspoken option to stay and fight and die on their own land. In June of 1861, General Yevdokimov began his final campaign, and this wasn't just an invasion, it was a colonial project. His army didn't just have soldiers, it had road builders, fort engineers, and Russian settlers following right behind them. The plan was simple and brutal. The army would roll into a valley, kill or drive out every Circassian they could find, and immediately, a new Russian fort or village would be built on the ashes of their homes. The Circassian tribes, in a last-ditch effort, called One Final Has, they finally agreed to form a central government to try and appeal to Europe for help. They even sent a delegation to meet the Tsar himself, Alexander II, when he visited the region in September 1861. It was an incredible scene. 500 Circassian leaders met him, laid their swords on the ground at his feet, and begged him to stop the violence. They offered to submit peacefully if he would just let them stay, and the Tsar was actually surprised. He seemed open to it, but General Yevdokimov was furious. He and the other Russian hardliners thought negotiating with these beasts was a waste of time. So he set one last cruel trap. He secretly sent a message to the Circassian leaders, telling them the Tsar was ready to agree to whatever they wanted. It was a lie, designed to make them ask for too much, and it worked. The Circassians, believing they had a real chance, presented the Tsar with a long list of demands, including a total stop to all colonization and deportations. The Tsar, who had been open to a simple submission, was now insulted. He gave them an ultimatum, 1 month. 1 month to agree to be resettled somewhere else in Russia, or be deported to Turkey. It was an impossible demand. The time for talking was over. In November 1861, Yevdokimov's massive army marched into Circassia. 65 battalions, 5 divisions of Cossacks, 100 cannons. They moved like lightning, and their orders were to burn every single village they found. Yevdokimov's own boss put it bluntly, "We must assume that we will need to exterminate the mountaineers before they will agree to our demands." What followed over the next few years wasn't a war, it was a slow, grinding extermination. There weren't many big, famous battles. It was a genocide made up of 1,000 small atrocities, 1,000 forgotten massacres in remote mountain valleys. Most of what we know comes from the Russians themselves, and even they were shocked by the fierce resistance of the Circassians. They fought to the very end. Often, the men of a village would make a final stand, fighting to the last man, just to buy a few more minutes for their wives and children to escape into the mountains. One Russian soldier wrote about seeing unarmed Circassians literally throwing themselves on our bayonet. The Russians didn't respect this bravery. They saw it as an insult. They couldn't understand why the Circassians wouldn't just give up. One officer wrote, with disgust, how they would flee into dark ravines and die of starvation in cold, rifle in hand, so that they may fire their final shot at the Russians. They thought the Circassians were dying just to spite them. The Russian tactics were systematic. They'd pick a valley, they'd send in the troops and burn every village. They'd kill everyone they found. Then, they'd pretend to leave. They'd pull back for a few days, and when the starving survivors crept out of the caves and forests they were hiding in, the troops would sweep back through and kill them all. They would repeat this over and over until they couldn't find anyone left to kill. The mountain passes, filled with columns of starving refugees, mostly women and children, trying to make it to the Black Sea coast. A French journalist saw families so hungry they were eating leaves off the trees. Disease was everywhere. Typhus, smallpox, malnutrition. One by one, the ancient tribes of Circassia were simply erased. The very last major fight happened on May 27, 1864, at a place the Circassians called Kabada. Today, we know it as Krasnaya Polyana, the Olympic ski resort. About 20,000 Circassian warriors made their final stand there. The women reportedly tore off their jewelry, picked up weapons, and fought and died right alongside the men. They knew they couldn't win. They were fighting, as one of their own historians wrote, to die honorably and to escape a life that had no hope left in it. The Russians slaughtered every last one of them, but for hundreds of thousands of others, the horror wasn't over. The ones who made it to the coast faced a new kind of hell. They were herded into massive, makeshift refugee camps to wait for the deportation ships. There wasn't enough food, not enough medicine, and nowhere near enough ships. A terrible winter hit, and people started dying by the thousands every single week. Starvation, disease, the freezing cold. The entire coast, according to the Russians' own letters, became a virtual graveyard. They stopped even trying to count the bodies. And General Yevdokimov, he got annoyed that his officers kept writing reports about all the frozen bodies. While people were dying in heaps, the authorities were blaming the Turkish ship captains for being too greedy. Because yes, the refugees had to pay to be deported. It cost 5 rubles. The Tsar generously offered 100,000 rubles in aid, which worked out to less than a quarter of a ruble per person. It was a joke. People sold everything they had left. Some even sold themselves or their children into slavery, just to buy a spot on a ship. The ships themselves were death traps. They were dangerously overcrowded. Some just sank from the weight. The ones that did sail were filled with disease. The death rates on those short voyages across the Black Sea were comparable to the Middle Passage of the Atlantic slave trade. The last Circassians were shipped out in early 1865. By then, the genocide was complete. At least 750,000 had been deported to Turkey. Another 230,000 had died on the coast or on the voyage. And in the mountains, hundreds of thousands more had been killed by Yevdokimov's army. The final death toll was somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million people. Their ancient homeland was empty, and Russian settlers were already moving in. It was a clear, calculated, and brutally successful campaign to remove a people from their land and replace them. It fits every definition of a modern genocide, and yet almost no one knows about it. The first major book about it, in English, wasn't published until to this day. Only one country on Earth, Georgia, officially recognizes it as a genocide. Russia still claims it was all just an unfortunate accident of war, and the Circassian people, their descendants scattered across the world, are still fighting just to have their history recognized. So when they see the world celebrating on the slopes of Krasnaya Polyana, they don't see a ski resort. They see the final, bloody battlefield of their ancestors. They see a mass grave, and they wonder why the world has chosen to forget. Thank you for watching.